Good morning. And it is a beautiful morning out there. But I got a little bit of a shock this morning when I looked at the thermometer. It was almost -5. A little colder than the forecast had indicated. But as I always like to say, it's considerably warmer here in this sanctuary with this group of people. And I'm always glad to be here, whether I'm speaking or whether I'm being spoken to. Now, before I go ahead, I'm going to move this just a little bit. And is this control the light here? Okay. Good. A better picture? All right, great. When I have spoken in the past, I've given testimonies of answered prayer and testimonies that speak to the wonderful love of God as I have experienced it in my life, as my parents and grandparents have experienced it. And they're great testimonies. But there is a third testimony that I have avoided giving because it's personally embarrassing to me. We don't like to say things or tell stories that make us look stupid or lacking in judgment. So over the years, I have avoided forming any kind of a sermon around this particular testimony. I was willing to acknowledge within myself that God had done a good thing, but too embarrassed to tell it publicly. Well, you're going to hear it today. I think I'm past that point in my life where my pride is so overwhelming that I can't admit to the occasional blunder. After all, I know that there's probably people in this congregation who have made the same mistake at some point in their life. All right, this is my veteran's cap, and I know you're not supposed to wear hats in a church. But I wear this with a great deal of pride, and I don't mean selfish pride. It means a great deal to me to have served in my country's army, especially during the first Gulf War. It's not a distinction that a lot of people bear. And I have on the cap 2 collar dogs. You can't really see them from there. This one was from the combat unit that I was in, and this one was from the intelligence unit that I was in during the last year of the 4 years I served. And you're probably wondering, what has a veteran's cap and military service got to do with my third testimony? Well, you're about to find out. Whenever I preach, I try to share something meaningful with the congregation, something they will remember and take home with them, or maybe even talk about amongst themselves later, or better yet, share with someone else who wasn't here to hear it. I believe that our time here on earth is so brief that it's extremely important that the message delivered from the pulpit be deeply relevant to our individual Christian walks. I always hope that I am not one of those preachers who waste the people's time going over something they've heard a dozen times before, or worse yet, one who puts members of the congregation to sleep. I say that with a certain amount of embarrassment as well, seeing how I frequently fall asleep in church myself. But it isn't because the preacher's boring, it's because I'm tired. Unfortunately, I have this chronic fatigue syndrome that gets in the way. In fact, I'm often so tired that when I go to church, I'm surprised I don't fall asleep during one of my own sermons. I'll try not to do that today. Now, you might not know this, but I'm always a little self-conscious whenever I deliver a sermon about something that has happened in my life. Someone in the Cornerstone Church made the comment that I like to talk about myself a lot, and I was tempted to think that they might be right. So I did some hard thinking about that. I wondered if there might not be a little selfishness in being the center of attention for 40 minutes or so. But I recollected that Ellen G. White was a strong advocate of personal testimonies. Not everybody, however, has those wonderful stories of God intervening to save their lives, like the story I told about being lost in the cave, or those of their loved ones, like the testimony I gave about unseen hands carrying my father through the house that was blowing up, it was exploding, and they were wrapped in mattresses and protected. Not everybody can relate episodes of dramatic answers to prayer or the intervention of God one-on-one, physically in their lives. Therefore, personal testimonies, when told, can be very encouraging to others who've had no similar experiences. Such stories are clear evidence that there is a great God who loves us supremely, and such stories boost the faith of our fellow Christians. A very good work is accomplished by those who speak of their own experiences with God's tremendous love. So, if Doug Batchelor can always talk about his life as a caveman in the mountains, I guess I can talk about my life as a combat soldier in the Canadian Army. There we go. Okay. Remembrance Day is just 9 days away. The day in which we recognize the sacrifice of 100,000 Canadians in the major wars of the 20th century. Sometimes we're tempted to think of these numbers as purely statistical. We are reluctant to recognize that each one of our war dead were people just like ourselves, with lives and families of their own. It's disturbing. Oh, by the way, that was me. That was me, yeah. Yeah, I was skinny at one time, eh? Oh, 1987 or 88, I'd just come out of basic training. So you can sort of date it by the weaponry. The M16 was just brand new in the Canadian Army at that time. So back to talking about each of the fallen soldiers. It's disturbing and at the very least uncomfortable to accept that for each soldier fallen in battle, there was a mother who wept, a wife who grieved, or a sister or a brother whose lives were forever changed by the sudden loss of someone they loved so much. And perhaps more importantly, each fallen soldier represents the end of a human being's opportunity for salvation and eternal life. I've often wondered how many soldiers went to their graves without that hope. I recollect from my time in service that for many of those young soldiers, God was a foreign concept. There was, by all interpretation, a godless approach to their existence. But not in every arena. So today, I'll be speaking about the exceptions to that. I'll be speaking about the people of the Canadian Army that I was privileged to meet during my time in uniform. They were no different than Canadians who recruited into the military in 1914 or 1939. For as human beings, we have at all points in history been essentially the same as now. So before we move into the sermon proper, I would like to just have a little prayer. Our God, our Father, we're talking about an element of human existence today that has unfortunately been with us since the inception of sin in heaven. Warfare is a horrid, horrid thing, Father. But you bring good things out of bad things, and that is the message that I want to leave with the people here today. So I pray you will open each heart and mind to that message in Jesus' name. Amen. Not so long ago, Southern Ontario was called British North America. There was that devotion to Mother England, and when England went to war, Canada went to war. Because southern Ontario was the most heavily populated part of Canada during the first two wars, most of the soldiers from Canada came from British North America. My Uncle Earl was a tail gunner in a Lancaster, at the back of the plane there. He knew that part of the planes very well. He was in the World War II. My Uncle Bev was in the Korean War. My cousin Wayne was in the Air Force, the RCAF. During World War II, several older men in my family, too old for combat, enlisted as guards for the thousands of Germans in the many POW camps in northern Ontario. I don't know how many of you know this, but all across Lake Superior and for many, many miles inland, there were detainment camps for tens of thousands of German prisoners. I've been to some of those camps, and the magnitude of those camps is truly humongous. They had no barbed wire because they knew that if the Germans, prisoners, attempted to escape, the elements would destroy them, would kill them. So, as you can see, there's a history of military service in my family, and perhaps some expectation that I would follow in that tradition. Even the Seventh-day Adventist pastor that baptized me had done 2 years in the Army. Later on, one of my pastors joined the Army. Long after the wars were over, there remained a tremendous respect for anyone who had or was enlisted in any of the military services, Army, Navy, Air Force, or cadets. For that reason, I had always planned to do a hitch in the military, but when we all became Seventh-day Adventists, that plan got derailed. I just didn't think that training to kill other people was fitting for someone who believed that killing was wrong. However, in 1987, an event took place in my life. My marriage failed. A marriage that I thought God had put together, but in recognized that was of my own design. I moved ahead into that marriage without properly consulting God as to whether he wanted me to do that or not. Because I wanted to be married to that particular girl without taking the proper precautions. When that marriage failed, I felt God had turned his back on me. A foolish assumption. I see now that I was entirely to blame for the events that had taken place during that 10 years. But my knee-jerk reaction was to blame God. I no longer cared, as a consequence, what was right or what was wrong, and decided to shut God out of my life. That's the embarrassing part, ladies and gentlemen. So I went out and enlisted in the military. My father was immensely proud, but my mother cried. No boys to get shot and killed in some war. I had said to her, "Mother, it's peacetime. There's likely to be no war for the next 40 years. 3 years later, I've always felt a little guilty about the despair I caused my mother. Seems she knew a little, maybe I didn't know. Now, the Canadian Army is divided into two parts: the Reserve, or part-time Army, and the full-time Army, known as the regular Army, or Reg Force, as they call it. I thought if I joined the Reserve Army, it wouldn't be as physically rigorous as the full-time Reg Force. The public perception of the Army Reserve was that it was more like a Boy Scout club than the real Army. I knew from ex-military family members just how demanding basic training could be, so thinking that I was going to circumvent all that agony and sweat, I recruited into a reserve unit. All you had to do was 2 years in the reserve unit. You could move right into the regular Army without going through the the grueling boot camps they had set up across Canada. But they put us on a bus late one night, and after 3 hours of driving in the dark, we arrived at an army base about 1 o'clock in the morning. An army base? They don't send an army base, do they? Well, they did us. It was a cold, gray place with 9-foot-high fences and about 2 feet of barbed wire on the top. We were promptly marched off to our barracks, where they issued us our bedding. To be made and then told us to make them. So we did. Then they yelled and screamed and ripped the beds all apart, turned them upside down, threw the blankets and pillows out the windows, and told us to do it again. But this time, in half the time. So we made our beds up again. Then they yelled and screamed and ripped the beds all apart again and said, do it again. But in half the time again. We repeated that routine 4 and maybe 5 times that night before they ordered us to bed at about 2 o'clock in the morning, no matter what the bed was like. Some had mud on their pillows and blankets from being thrown out the window 4 times. A short 3 hours later, we were all outside on the tarmac doing push-ups in 5 inches of snow. I couldn't figure this out. What was going on? The reserves were not supposed to be like this. This was more like the regular army. I was puzzled. By 8 a.m. that morning, the puzzle was solved. All 200 of us recruits from across Canada were assembled on a large parade square, where it announced that a recent act of Parliament had just ordered all Army Reserve boot camp training to be placed under the command of the regular Army. Our officers, our drill sergeants, and section commanders were all regular Army personnel. So much for trying to take the easy way out. That song went through my head. You're in the Army now. You know that one? It wasn't what I thought it was going to be, but oh well. I was there for the duration and full steam ahead. The first 4 days were tough. A lot of yelling orders, derisive comments, a lot of recruits messing up and receiving push-ups or extra duties for punishment. 5 people quit, and I thought, more than one a day. And if we continue to lose people at this rate, there won't be too many of us left after the training is over. Apparently the base commander thought so too, because they announced that from this point on, nobody quits. Our Sergeant Major said, gentlemen, you are here for the duration. Things progressed at a fairly rapid rate. How to wear the uniform correctly, the chain of command, long-distance jogging, weapons training, grenade throwing, marksmanship, marching and parade square drill, nuclear, biological, chemical warfare training, and that's just the beginning. In days, we moved on into basic training, infantry training. After 5 months, we graduated and were invited to join various regiments we had recruited into. We were one of the first Canadian regiments to recruit women into combat roles. In a bid to exercise political correctness, the Canadian Army relaxed its long-standing rule of men only for combat service. Women in the training was no less intense just because there were women, and there was tears and blubbering, and sometimes it was the girls. But those 3 made it through. You learn a tremendous amount in boot camp and basic training, not just military savvy, but basic behavior. When it's 104 degrees, you got another 7 miles to march with a full 60-pound pack. You're out of water and you haven't eaten a decent meal or slept in 3 days. Your stomach is churning with hunger pangs, and if that doesn't sound bad enough, squadrons of mosquitoes accompany you the whole way, and you're starting to get blisters in your feet, you're soaked to the skin with sweat, and everybody stinks. How do you cope with that? We're not making this up. Anyone who's done military training well remembers this scenario, and they put you into it purposely to see how much you can take before you crack, or if you're going to crack at all. So under those conditions, people react one of two ways. They either turn on each other or they pull together. You know, take on the chin, we're all in this together. And you find out who is strong and who is weak. Sometimes the big who freaks out and loses it and starts screaming at the section commander in the office. I've seen that. More than once I've seen that. And the one who holds it together with a smile and pushes through to the end is the little 5-foot blonde girl who's determined to prove to herself and to the world that she can make it in a man's army. All three of those girls made it through. So that's the beauty of the human equation. Each one of us has a different psychological makeup, and that alone is what determines whether we succeed or fail in any endeavor. So to recap, in 1987, my first marriage failed. I somehow thought God had failed me, that he had not led me to my soulmate, and rather than recognize my own lack of wisdom as the cause of my sorrow, I blamed God and decided to place myself in the company of those who had no regard for God either. Somehow, I had gotten the idea that there was no group of people more godless on earth than combat soldiers. So I joined the army in a deliberate attempt to escape God. I pulled a little Jonah act. I got on the ship to Tarshish. I didn't stop believing in God. I just decided I didn't like the way he did business. I still held dear the Advent message with the Sabbath, the state of the dead, and all the other beliefs unique to Adventism. But I was on my way to Tarshish. I chose to cut and run and to run off and pout a while. It just seemed the army was a perfect place for that. I said nothing to anybody about my Adventist background. I just wanted to be accepted as another secular man in a secular world, in a secular army. But God would not accept that plan. He had other plans, and he wanted to include me in them. At the time, now that slide was for the previous statement where I talked about the blubbering and the crying. Because actually we did have the girls on time from time to time break down a little bit physically. So where was I? Yeah, I said nothing to anyone about my Adventist background. I just wanted to be accepted as another secular man. But God had other plans for me. I just at the time. And I find it so hard that those times when we give up on God, he's not bound to give up on us. No rule that says he has to give up on him. And he hangs in there and he does what he can to bring you back. That night when we all got on that bus and headed off to boot camp, I expected that my comrades would all be rough and burly, slack-jawed apes who weren't smart enough to get their job but the army. Instead, as I looked around at the other fellows on board, I just were respectable looking, of average to above average intelligence, from middle to upper class homes where both mom and dad loved their children and treated them well. I learned very quickly that the army was not the collection of drooling knuckle-walkers that current popular opinion painted them up to be. Something else I saw was a little bit of fear in the eyes and in the words of those young men as they tried to ease their uncertainty of the future by talking to each other. For many of these fellows, this was the first time they'd ever left home, and they were a bit scared. So what do you think they talked about? What do you think they said? I would have thought so. But because they were scared, they now suddenly had no fear of God. They'd obviously learned about God at home, and they carried that with them into their military experience. It gave them comfort to talk about a loving being who had their best interests at heart. I thought, all these guys must come from Christian families. But if they keep talking like that, the other fellows in the bus will soon shut them down. Nobody likes a Jesus freak, right? Wrong. Pretty soon the entire bus was discussing how their belief in God would be impacted by their decision to become an infantry soldier. I thought, oh no, this is exactly what I thought I was going to be getting away from. Then one of them turned to me and said, how about you? What's your feelings about God and being in the Army? Boy, there wasn't much wiggle room in that question. My plans to go away into obscurity were about to be shot out of the water. Now, God knows who his people are, and he knows the knowledge that they possess. And when opportunity comes knocking, he wants his people to share that knowledge, because the world still dwells in relative ignorance of biblical truth and who God really is. We are still in the Dark Ages. I mean, we emerged in 1798 officially, but doctrinally, we are still in the Dark Ages. That medieval mindset of God as an angry judge drives millions away from a meaningful relationship with him. So, when there's somebody who knows that God is a being of great love, he puts them in situations where they have an opportunity to testify to that. This I knew very well, so I could not answer that question. So I opened my mouth and began to speak. And everybody on that bus listened. I was amazed that the vast majority of people are deeply interested in knowing more about God. I don't know why I've got that one there. I think I might be ahead one frame. I'll just keep talking. I was originally to declare my faith because I did not want to be thought of as a holy Joe or a fanatic. But when I did speak, that never happened. Several of the young recruits came to me after our training began and wanted to continue asking me questions. I continued to be somewhat reluctant to answer because this was getting in the way of my plans to push God out of my life. Now here I was getting a bit of a reputation as an instructor and well respected for it. And I just wanted to go the other way and leave my Christian life behind. Whenever we had a regimental ball or a Christmas dinner for the unit, who do you think they ordered to offer the prayer of thanksgiving before the meal? Despite my wishes to the contrary, I now had a reputation. God was not going to let me lapse into obscurity. I knew too much about him to just sit in silence. Now I remember why I've got that in there. That's the mess uniform for the Christmas dinner. And that's for the officers' mess dinners as well. Beautiful uniforms. I always figured I looked like a Mountie in that one. Notice the Canadian flag borders on both sides. Okay. I'll talk about those guys in a minute. Sometime later, we were ordered to attend what they called a Padres parade. In the Army, anytime you get together for something special, they call it a parade. You don't do any marching around when you're there, wherever they're having the parade, but maybe it's because you have to march to where the event was happening. And that's a parade of sorts, I suppose. I don't know. But we got ordered to a Padres parade, 2 hours of listening to a chaplain speak to us. Now, in the Army, all the chaplains are officers, usually captains, and this fellow was no exception. His last name, however, was could be a bit confusing. His last name was Sergeant. So his fellow officers simply referred to him as, "Hey, Sergeant." And we had to refer to him as Captain, which created no small amount of confusion in the minds of new recruits trying to figure out who everybody was and what their rank was. So Captain Sergeant was our Padre, or chaplain as he preferred to be called, because Padres were usually Catholic, but he was Protestant. There were 32 of us in our platoon, And we were all ordered to grab a chair and form a big circle around him. Then the first question he asked was, how many here believe in God? Out of our entire platoon, there were only 2 hands that did not go up. He turned to those 2 and leaned over and said, tell me why. Why don't you believe there's a God? The 2 young recruits looked at each other, and one of them said, well, I've just never seen any proof that he exists. The captain straightened up again and questioned, belief is not something you establish on the basis of evidence. I have been in combat, seen firsthand that when those bullets start flying, there isn't a single man who doesn't suddenly believe in God. Belief in God is something that every human being carries with him. He knows instinctively in his heart. You don't have to see him to know he's real. And if you search your heart honestly and earnestly, you'll come to the same conclusion that there has to be a God, because nothing else makes sense. He then turned to the rest of us with a somewhat disturbing question. He said, so, if you guys all claim to believe in God, then you'll know that his law says, thou shalt not kill. What are you doing here? How do you rationalize that with the fact that you all have enlisted in the infantry, a military organization dedicated to killing other human beings? It's what you trained to do. We're going to teach you over 30 different ways to kill another person. I was starting to not like this guy. All our training officers and drill sergeants were dedicated to the destruction of any human being who threatened the Canadian way of life. In fact, the whole purpose of the Army was to kill when ordered to do so. Everywhere we turned, we were bombarded with this philosophy. And now this chaplain comes along and throws out a question like that. Everybody's focus was suddenly knocked sideways with a great big, huh? Of course, his purpose was to elicit a response from the men, to make them think about what they were doing in the Army in the first place, to identify the reasons why one might have to kill, especially if they don't really. He was trying to draw our attention to the fact that killing an enemy is a last resort after all other options have been exhausted. Even by the same logic. In Ezekiel 33:11, God says, I have pleasure in the death of the wicked. Why? This is the mindset that all our soldiers are trained to adopt, and this is why so many Canadian soldiers are shipped off to peacekeeping duty in some countries of the world. But when negotiation fails, the time comes when it is expected every Canadian soldier will perform his duty as trained with efficiency and dedication and take human life if ordered to do so. I don't approve of it, but that's reality in a sinful world. This has been the way Canada has trained its young men of war, and I believe that this is the reason why Canada never lost a war. Wars are inevitable, but when one comes along, I believe God blesses those nations that hold high the same standards that God himself abides by. I let that go, didn't I? I got was doing pretty good there for a while. Thank you kindly. Okay. Okay, I gotta go back here. Now, I had sworn my oath of service to Queen Elizabeth, along with all the other recruits, on February 5th of 1987, to do 4 years, then apply for a release. So 4 years later, I was looking forward to returning to a purely civilian existence once again on February 5th, 1991. During my 4th year in, I decided to muster out of the infantry into some other branch of the service. I joined an intelligence company under the umbrella of CSIS, the Canadian Secret Intelligence Service. Now, I know it all sounds cloak and dagger, but it was nothing like that. I trained as a military policeman, then on, and that's the Red Beret, by the way. That's my unit, military police unit. Then on January the 19th of 1991, a date I'll never forget, just days before my release date of February the 5th, the U.S., along with England, Canada, France, and Australia, declared war on Saddam Hussein and his Republican Guard Army. I knew then I wasn't getting out of the Army anytime soon, because the Army takes a dim view of anyone who tries to get out whenever a war starts up. Besides, my conscience wouldn't let me take leave when all my buddies were going off to war. So the arrival of the first Gulf War, everything suddenly changed. Our unit was one of those chosen for mobilization to overseas duty. Immediately, our training switched from writing out citations and breaking up fistfights on base to that of the interrogation of prisoners. I actually thought it might be an interesting switch from writing out tickets until our instructors began teaching us the various methods of torture that we would be employing to extract information from cooperative prisoners. Somewhat tongue-in-cheek, our training instructors referred to this as the art and science of persuasion. The methods employed were barbaric and beyond brutal. They involved electricity as well as many other techniques, some of them used by the Inquisition in centuries past. The agony inflicted on the victim is beyond anything that mortal man can endure, and after receiving the full course on these methods, I recognized that no mere man would be able to keep a single item secret under such torture. At this point, I became disillusioned with the Canadian military. I had always believed that Canada was too benevolent, too civilized a nation to resort to such medieval tactics. The complete lack of mercy disturbed me greatly, and I was keenly disappointed that this beautiful country of Canada should besmirch their global reputation for kindness and mercy by inflicting such hideous treatment on other human beings. And should we be shipped out to the Middle East, it was expected that we do just that. I said, Lord, I can't do that to another person. I just can't. If he's shooting at me, trying to kill me, I'd likely have no problem shooting back, even if it was just to keep his head down. But to tie him to a chair, defenseless and naked, and attach electrical clips to him and crank the voltage up to 400 volts, it wasn't in me to do things like that to other people. I secretly prayed that I would not have to go. I wondered how it would go when my commanding officer gave the order to torture, because I knew I would refuse to obey. All my buddies, on the other hand, seemed eager and couldn't wait for the opportunity to strap some poor Iraqi soldier to the chair and try out everything they'd been taught in Cease's company. As it turned out, with just a few weeks remaining before we were to ship out, the Americans sewed up everything and we didn't have to go. We all would have got a nice shiny medal if we had gone, but I was just as glad that we didn't. That would have been the UN medal, the blue. And we all wanted that. That was a beautiful medal. As it turned out, Kuwait issued millions upon millions of bronze medals, and I did receive. And on the way to church today, I realized I should have brought that. Should have let them see what it looked like, but I forgot. So anyway, it was about that time I would catch myself talking to God again. I guess I wasn't so upset with him anymore. The Tarshish experience depicted by Jonah here is now behind me. I was no longer running. I had learned my lesson well. I could run, but I couldn't hide. So I gave up trying to hide. I got my release from the Army 3.5 months after the war was over, and took up teaching high school, which in itself is kind of ironic, because I actually saw more bloodshed in the schools of Toronto than I ever saw in the Army. One day, cleaning out some old boxes in my basement, I found the Bible that had been given to me at my baptism. I casually opened it and began to read the part that says that you don't put new wine in old bottles. And I understood what it meant. I'd never understood that verse before. But somehow, I guess, 10 years away from God had sharpened my perception, allowed me to see the contrast between things spiritual and non-spiritual. Symbolism was clear. It was very fulfilling to now understand that which had eluded since my baptism at 12. Jesus was talking about the new covenant. I put that Bible on my bedside stand and read from it every evening, perhaps 45 minutes before going to sleep each night. And everything I read was now so fresh and new to me, I wondered how I could have ever failed to understand this stuff when I was younger. It wouldn't be until 1997, however, that I returned to full-time attendance at the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Richmond Hill. I chose to be rebaptized, so how ironic that running to the army in an effort to get away from God, I found my testifying on his behalf and serving him despite my resolve to the contrary. The observation of the faith of other non-Adventist Christians was almost a rebuke to my selfish decision to sever my connection with him. I felt like John deliberately abandoned the commission God had given him and tried to discreetly sneak out of God's sight. So if I may, I would like to share with this congregation today the lessons I learned through my time in the army, or my wanderings in the desert, I like to call it. They go as follows. Number one, God has his people everywhere, and they are not all Seventh-day Adventists. There is no country, no institution, no segment of society or human organization where you are ever truly free from the influence of someone who believes in the God of creation. Even in places like the Masonic Lodge, communist countries, even the army, where you least expect them, they show up. And if you are not a witness to them, they will be a witness to you. And you will never have a moment's peace until you share your experience with them. Lesson: you might choose to walk away from God thinking that that's all you have to do to fade into the crowd. But you are an end-time messenger. You are a Seventh-day Adventist. You are different. You are a harbinger of truth. You do not belong to one of those churches that is steeped in error. You are a rare commodity. He said on a hill, the light of the world. As an Adventist, you possess a knowledge of the end-time message, the health message, and prophetic understanding through the spirit of prophecy. God has a lot in you. They used to tell us in the Army that by the time you're finished your first year in the Army, that they will have invested $20,000 in your training. That is one reason why they are reluctant to allow anyone in the peacetime Army to quit. They want to get at least 4 years out of you. But God has even more invested in you. He has an entire lifetime, and he has the future, the eternity of the universe, because he wants you there. And God will seek you out and do his best to bring you back, because he needs you in his army. Or to put it another way, you can run, but you can't hide. There is a war on, and God will not allow you to become a deserter. It is not an option. Lesson number 3, and the last one. When an opportunity to witness arises, be instant in season. Do not hesitate to respond when opportunity